There are more prisoners in the US than any other country in the world. We examine the impact of the high incarceration rate on the penal system and on poor communities. You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rattansi. The US makes up 5% of the world's population and 25% of its prison population. Over the last 3 decades, the number held in US federal prisons has jumped by nearly 800%. According to a recent report by the Government Accountability Office, overcrowding has contributed to worse safety and security conditions for both inmates and staff. The overcrowded prisons have contributed to a multi-billion-dollar demand for private prisons. The industry argues it's helping the government save money. But others argue for-profit prisons only increase the incentive to incarcerate more people. And the impact of mass imprisonment spreads far beyond the prison walls. Sociologists have found that the rise in incarceration rates reduces social mobility and ensures both prisoners and their families remain trapped in a cycle of poverty. And joining us now is David Fathi. He's the director of the American Civil Liberties Union National Prison Project. From Pittsburgh, we have Matthew Mangino. He's a former district attorney in Pennsylvania. And back here in the studio, Marc Mauer, the executive director of the Sentencing Project and author of the book Race to Incarcerate. David, first of all, let's just look first of all at how overcrowded the prisons are before we actually ask how we got here. The number of inmates in US federal prisons has increased from about 25,000 in 1980 to 219,000 in 2012, according to a report by the US Congressional Research Service. The report says the federal prison system was 39% over its capacity in 2011. The situation is worse for high and medium security male facilities. High security prisons were overcrowded by 51%, medium security prisons overcrowded by 55% in 2011. David, how has this been allowed to happen?
Well, there has been in this country over the last 30 years a relentless upward climb in the incarcerated population. And disturbing as the situation is with the federal prison system, that's really only the tip of the iceberg, because the federal prison system is only about 10% of the total number of people incarcerated in this country. On any given day, we have about 2.3 million people behind bars in federal, state, and local facilities. And that is the highest incarceration rate of any country in the world, a rate that's between 5 and 10 times the rate in our peer nations like Canada, the UK, France. So the US really is a global outlier in this area.
And we mentioned the Government Accountability Office report that just came out about the impact of those conditions on prisoners and prison staff, for that matter. But I know the ACLU has done a lot of work on how punitive conditions were even before the overcrowding as well there.
That's true, and there continue to be punitive conditions in U.S. prisons that aren't directly related to overcrowding. For example, my office just won a case in Alabama where we successfully overturned a policy of segregating all prisoners who are HIV positive and making them wear white armbands to identify themselves. Solitary confinement is used in this country to an extent and for lengths of time that is unparalleled in any other democratic country. So the crowding and the numbers is probably the most salient feature of the U.S. prison system, but there are other punitive and problematic aspects that aren't directly related to sheer numbers and to overcrowding.
Well, let's focus then on the numbers who are being incarcerated then. Matthew Mangino, to what extent did the policy of mandatory minimum sentencing then contribute to this situation that we have right now?
Well, certainly it's had an impact on the state and on the federal level. There's also issues of over-criminalization. There's a great deal of debate about the expansion of the federal crimes code from a few potential sentences that could be punitive to thousands of sentences. So I think that mandatory minimums have had an impact. I think also there has been some effort to address some of those issues on a state and a federal level. For instance, finally, the federal government took up the issue of the discrepancy between powder and crack cocaine, which has had a significant impact on the African American population of our country. So there is work underway. I think policymakers have come to the realization on a state and federal level that you can't necessarily build yourself out of a crime situation, that we just can't continue at these numbers to incarcerate people, and the impact on state budgets and the money spent on a federal level to deal with mass incarceration has just left us in a lot of ways unprotected in other areas that we would expect state government or federal government to be involved. So I think there is a realization that there's a problem. It's just how are we going to begin to deal with that problem and also continue to promote public safety?
Mark, I mean, do you see that there is a realization then of the problem, and is that partly because, I mean, was there any effect on the crime rate of mandatory minimum sentencing? Can that actually be? Can that be? I mean, can you see that on a spreadsheet, for example, then? I mean, was it an effective policy? Is it an effect?
Well, I don't think very much. I mean, if you look at the explosion in the prison population, the question is, does prison have an effect on crime? Well, yes, it has some effect. The fact that people like Charles Manson have been behind bars and people who present a serious threat of violence to the community, clearly there's some effect. But I think it's pretty widely regarded now by people who study these issues that we're long past the point of diminishing returns. That as we've continued to expand prisons, often with lower level offenders, lots of people on lower levels of the drug trade, the additional benefit we get compared to the cost that we incur, it doesn't make it a very good bet these days.
What about length of sentences? I mean, what's the purpose then of locking up a teenager up until they're 40 years old or something? Is there any kind of examination of that process?
Well, there is, and unfortunately, the United States has become a world leader in this regard as well. 1 of every 11 people in prison today is serving a life sentence, and many of them life without the possibility of parole. And these numbers have been escalating dramatically. And among the many problems with that, and aside from being, I think, unjust and unfair in many cases, the sheer cost of it. By locking up people who are now 50, 60, 70-year-old with huge healthcare costs, among other things, we have a finite budget for public safety. So the challenge is, do we continue to incarcerate people as they age in prison, or what do we do about 13, 14, 15-year-olds who are starting to get into trouble? Could we intervene more productively by investing in working on some of those issues?
Just very quickly there, I mean, was it, David, a relatively recent phenomenon? I mean, obviously mandatory minimum sentences was relatively recent, I suppose, but as far as the lengthening of sentences, has this been a recent phenomenon there, or has this been going on for some time? How does that work?
I think it really began in the late 1970s and continued through the 80s and 90s. And there is, I mean, as Mark says, I mean, we already have 1 in 11 people serving a life sentence. There's sort of an upward limit to how much more punitive you can get. So I hope that trend has run its course. And as has been said, I think we're beginning to see some retrenchment and some reforms percolating up in at least some states.
Well, you've all already alluded to the war on drugs and that's the impact of that on the incarceration rates. In fact, if we look at who is being incarcerated, nearly half of federal prisoners are drug offenders. But a long way behind that are those related to weapons, those imprisoned for offences related to weapons, explosives and arson. That's 16% of inmates. Those convicted of immigration violations make up 12% of the federal prison population. And then demographically, African Americans, who represent 12% of the US population, make up 37% of federal prisoners, and Latinos, 16% of the population, but 35% of prisoners. And I know, Mark, you've done a great deal of work on the effect on communities and the effect on their chances of actually getting out of poverty as a result of this.
Well, research from the Justice Department shows us that a black male born today has a 1 in 3 chance of doing time in prison in his lifetime, a Latino male 1 in 6. Those numbers, I think, should be shocking to anyone, regardless of your political perspective or your definition of how the problem came about. And it should call our attention the fact that this is an intolerable situation. The problem is now we have kids growing up in these low-income communities of color who in many cases believe their chances of going to prison are far greater than their chances of going to university. And that's a very bad message that we seem to be sending to kids these days growing up. And it seems to many kids, I think, that there's almost no way out of it. It's almost inevitable you'll have time in the prison system.
Matthew, and a big factor in this then is this war on drugs. And this is people with non-violent drug offences who are being sent to prison. Is that correct?
Well, there certainly are some non-violent people who've been sent to prison because of drug offenses. And I think we need to put that into some context. I mean, when we're talking about people who get lengthy federal sentences, we're not normally talking about recreational users of drugs. We're talking about drug dealers, people who are dealing a lot of drugs, and there's a lot of money involved, and often weapons and violence as well. But I agree certainly with what Mark is saying. I mean, I spent 6 years on the parole board in Pennsylvania and talked to literally thousands of inmates, and I understand that there is no opportunity for some of these people in certain communities. They basically, this is a way of life. Whether it's dealing drugs, whether it's violence, it's what they've come to know. We need to do a better job of investing in those types of communities and providing opportunity for people. When I looked at some of the statistics, and we know that, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, we spent 45% of our criminal justice funding on policing. Now we spend 40% of it on imprisonment. We need to divert those funds into communities, to provide opportunity for people, and to give somebody the hope that they're not just going to be in this endless cycle of incarceration.
But Matthew points out, though, that certainly for the lengthy sentences, then, it is usually the dealers. But I guess part of the problem, when we talk about overcrowding, though, it's those shorter sentences, perhaps, for non-violent crimes. Illinois, the figures for 2009, I mean, it cost them $1 billion, to run their state prison. 70% of those who were incarcerated in non-violent crimes, and 50% sentences of less than 6 months. So, I mean, that's part of the problem as well. Though,
and certainly in California, which has horrendous overcrowding, much of that is being driven by technical parole violators. Those are people who have been released on parole. They commit a technical violation, not a new crime, but, for example, missing a meeting with their parole officer, and they get yanked back into prison. And that was a huge driver of the massive overcrowding in California. So it's not all or even mostly people in for serious violent crimes.
And the effect then on the recidivism rate is key there, I suppose, as well, of reoffending, because given the overcrowding and the lack of resources, are people with drug offences able to get treatment? Are those who've committed other offences able to get rehabilitated as well? I suppose that's part of the problem then.
Well, the recidivism rates have been very high. About half the people who come out of prison are back again 3 years later. And, many corrections administrators, are not very happy about this. Many of them would like to run a decent prison system. They would like to offer opportunities. But what we've seen for the last several decades is that legislators have been glad to provide funding to build and fill prisons, but money for programming, which was in short supply before this explosion, is probably even more scarce today.
And then when we went through those figures a moment ago about who make up the prison population, clearly a significant number then on immigration offences. And this, Matthew, Operation Streamline in 2005 then required federal criminal prosecution and imprisonment for all unlawful border crossings. I mean, what's been the effect of that?
Well, certainly the immigration issue is a difficult issue. I know, again, in the work that I've done in the past, especially with regard to deportation, you'd have a deportation issue, and you'd have that particular offender right back in the United States offending again. The statistics in Arizona indicate that a number of immigration violations that have been deported come back into the states and again are involved in criminal activity. The immigration issue is certainly one that has created a great deal of revenue for private prisons. It's created revenue indirectly for state facilities, which house federal inmates. And some of that has been driven by the fact that it's a revenue producer. So there are a lot of issues and complex issues involved in this immigration issue.
So a first-time offence, an immigration offence, and 6-month minimum sentence for crossing the border. If there's been a previous attempt, it's 2 years, or up to 20 if you have a criminal record. I mean, that must have had a huge impact on the justice system itself then, I would imagine.
Yeah, it is really increasingly swamping the federal court system, and as you point out, expanding, driving the growth of the federal prison system, which now I believe 1 in 4 prisoners in the federal system is a non-U.S. citizen, largely because of the criminalization of what were previously civil immigration violations.
What's interesting is that when President Obama talks about immigration reform, Mark, he still, though, seems to be suggesting that the major plank of any reform would be increased enforcement, though. That doesn't seem to be an issue that's on the table for negotiation.
Yeah, we've clearly had stepped up enforcement in recent years. It's been supported by and large by both political parties, and that seems to be the sort of trade-off or so for opening a path to citizenship that will have this level of enforcement. And I think we should look at what impact that's had, what the cost is, and whether there are other ways to achieve our long-term immigration goals rather than relying on a large-scale prison system.
Interestingly, in that immigration debate, it was recently discovered that private prisons have been lobbying very hard on the immigration issue, though, specifically. Even some of the bipartisan Senate group on comprehensive immigration reform, for example, the majority of those have got a huge amount of money from private prisons. What role are they playing then in all of this? How do they see immigration reform right now? Well,
private corporations always try to increase the demand for their services, and that's probably okay when you're selling hamburgers or bicycles, but when you're selling incarceration, it's very problematic. 50 years ago, President Eisenhower warned us about the rise of a military-industrial complex. And what we have in the United States today is a prison-industrial complex, a whole constellation of corporations that have everything to gain by promoting increased incarceration, whether it's on the immigration side or in prisons and jails.
At the moment, though, mainly it's nearly half of all migrant offences go to private prisons, less so, though, for other offences. Is that correct?
That's true, although the absolute number of people in private prisons is still greater on the criminal prison side than on the immigration detention side.
Right, okay.
The interesting thing about private prisons is if you look at the contractual arrangements with some states, for instance, Ohio just sold an existing prison to a private prison company with a contract that says that they'll keep 90% capacity in that prison. Arizona, the state of Arizona, has similar contracts with private prisons that they'll maintain 90% capacity within those prisons.
So, David, I mean, this is where then we get the Corrections Corporation of America talking to its investors about, quote, predictable revenue streams. But that then, a predictable revenue stream means a high level of incarceration and a high level of recidivism as well. Then,
exactly.
And they're quite open about it, though.
That's right. I mean, when they talk
are they in charge of preventing people from offending again, though, in their facilities?
Well, I think you've identified a real tension. I think that everyone hopes that incarceration will have some positive effect on the prisoner and will reduce recidivism and will, in some sense, make him or her better when he comes out than when he went in. But as you point out, there's a pretty obvious conflict of interest when you're talking about corporations that make more money the more people are locked up, and quite openly talk to their stockholders about predictable revenue streams and growth industries. All
right, then. So we have now state and local authorities, Mark, bucking the federal trend then, and apparently then realizing that they can't afford this anymore. Right. Is it simply based around the issue of money, or are they actually fundamentally rethinking the prison system, what it's for, what it's, why we have people locked up?
Yeah. Well, money is really getting their attention these days, and I think it's a significant force. But I think over the last decade or so, we've seen growing interest among both political parties in what they sometimes call evidence-based corrections, basically saying, how do we invest our money for real public safety benefits? It may make some people feel good to send lots of people to prison, but the real measure is, are we having an impact on crime by doing so? And if we're not having the impact we should be having, what is a better balance of how we spend our funds to get better outcomes from that. And certainly, in the war on drugs, the most prominent example is you get liberals and conservatives alike who now strongly believe that we have to invest in treatment and prevention much more heavily rather than relying on incarceration.
And this is what we've been saying with new reform of drug possession laws, for example, I suppose. Was that then, would you say, then driven partly by the budgetary constraints of the prison?
It was both budgetary constraints, but also, most Americans know someone close to them who's had a drug or alcohol problem. I think increasingly people can understand that taking somebody who's a low-level drug seller who's trying to support his habit and throwing him in a prison cell for 5 years without providing treatment, we're just kidding ourselves if we think we're making a difference doing that. So I think there's been a search for other ways to deal with that individual and deal with the drug trade more constructively.
And other solutions, I guess we've seen the 3 strikes and you're out law in California being amended somewhat, I suppose.
Right.
But what else would we talk about? Lighter sentences? Is there a political, isn't that political suicide to start saying, well, maybe we shouldn't be locking people up for?
I think it's less radioactive than it used to be. I mean, we are in an era now where crime rates, including violent crime rates, have been falling quite dramatically for a number of years now. And I think the issue is just much less explosive than it used to be. And so I think there is an opening. And when you add to that the fiscal crisis, where states simply cannot keep spending on prisons the way they have in the past, I think these factors taken together create an opening for the kind of evidence-based practices that Marc is talking about, and looking at what are we really getting for the tens of billions of dollars that we spend on incarceration.
How difficult is it to make that argument, Matthew, though, that it's probably better to have more money for rehabilitation programs, perhaps then factor in some kind of earned release program for completing rehab programs and things like that, as opposed to just locking people up like sardines and looking tough on crime?
Well, I don't want to seem cynical, but for politicians, I think it's much easier today, or much more palatable today, to be considered maybe a little soft on crime as opposed to raising taxes. And that's the choice that politicians have been forced to make. Do I raise taxes to pay for incarceration, or do I do something more practical but be perceived or labeled a soft on crime? I think in some states like Texas, for instance, they've shown by using evidence-based practices and using treatment that they've been able to reduce recidivism. They've been able to reduce the number of people in prison, and Texas has been traditionally a law and order state. So when Texas has made that step, other states have done so as well. And so you have this Justice Reinvestment Initiative, which a number of states across the country are involved in, where they're trying to take money that otherwise would have been used to house people in prison, lower that population, and then filter that money down into treatment programs and policing and other efforts in the community to curb recidivism. So I think there's been some models out there that clearly show that they work, and other states are trying to replicate those.
Well, it's very nice to hear some sort of progressive victory then for common sense, perhaps then. But Marc, how optimistic are you, though, especially when you look at the communities that you've studied at great length? What's it going to mean for an inner city community in Baltimore? Are you actually really seeing a change anytime soon for these places?
Well, the change is very incremental so far, certainly. So, somewhat fewer people are going to prison or in prison any given moment or so. But, I don't know that these effects are felt yet in the community, given the modest change that we're seeing. So if we really want to see some substantial change, the opportunities of those communities, we need to look about a serious reduction of prison population, more than just a 1 or 2% that we're seeing in most states. There are a couple of states, New York and New Jersey, have reduced their prison populations 20-25% actually in the last decade through some very conscious initiatives that they've taken advantage of, and no adverse effects on crime as a result. So I think the possibilities are out there, but we're still at the very early stages.
And underlying this entire debate, David, and we've kind of skirted around it, but we haven't really answered it. What is prison for exactly, though? How would you answer that question?
Well, that's obviously a complicated question.
We only have a minute left.
Okay, I think most people would agree there's 2 main purposes of incarceration. One is incapacitation, to keep people who are physically dangerous from hurting other people, and keep people, even if they're not physically dangerous, from committing additional crimes, to incapacitate them from further criminal activity. I think the second main objective is retribution, to manifest society's disapproval of these kinds of behavior, and certainly very strong disapproval of serious crimes like rape and murder and so on. But how you translate that into a concrete sentencing policy, how many years for which crimes, that's where it gets complicated. And then that's where I think a lot of the remaining disagreement about what kind of sentencing policy we should have continues to exist.
David Fathi, thank you very much. Marc Mauer, thank you. Matthew Mangino, thank you very much as well. And that's it from the team in Washington, D.C. for now.